Hi, my name is Ajit Nanin and welcome to the session on display technical considerations for volumetric immersive experiences. So you might be wondering what a person from Dolby is doing at a optical conference, so it might be valuable for you to understand what Dolby does in general. So what we do is we collaborate with the industry across the ecosystem to create compelling experiences. What that means is we work with the content creators, with the distributors and the device manufacturers to bring Dolby experience in every dimension to the user. So in 2007, we decided to ask the question, what is the next generation visual experience? The way we did that in 2007 was to actually build a high dynamic range display and put it in front of content creators and users and ask them to tweak an image until they felt like it looked the best. So what we did was we gave them control over the highlights and the diffuse whites, and what they could do is adjust the knob to create a difference between the highlights and the diffuse whites. And what you'll see is that there seems to be almost like a clarity in the image as you keep increasing the highlights with relationship to the diffuse whites. And you can imagine on your display the brights probably don't get bright enough to represent the sun, but on a Dolby display that we built, you can actually get up to 4,000 nits, which is many times brighter than most displays out there today. And this is a display we built almost 10 years ago now. The results of the study kind of showed that there was a big gap in what the users wanted and what was in front of them today. And if you look at what they were watching in cinema and what they were watching in TV, the distribution for the black level, where people were satisfied, it needed to get to 0.005 nits before people were satisfied at 90%. And if you wanted 90% of your viewers to be satisfied with the diffuse white, it would have to be at 4,000 nits. And the highlights would have to be at 20,000 nits. If you compare that to what they were getting today as 0.1 nits in the black and maybe 100 to 300 nits on the brights. So you could see there was a huge discrepancy in what people wanted from their black levels to the diffuse white levels and the highlights. So improving the display alone didn't make a difference, because what was happening was the ecosystem at the distribution side was the bottleneck. So the cameras could capture the dynamic range, but as soon as it got to distribution, they would compress that dynamic range. In this picture, for example, you'll see that the clouds had to be blown out in order to preserve her face. The colorists would make those trade-offs and result in this picture that was transmitted to the TV. So if you had a display that could actually do a higher dynamic range, that signal that was sent to you was not good enough because they were just stretching that image. And so you just get an overall brighter image, but you still don't have any details in the cloud. So it wasn't exactly what the image intended to be seen by the director was transmitted to the house. We had to find a way to fix that in order to give you a display that had a tremendous amount of dynamic range. And fixing that bottleneck is what Dolby Vision does. And how we do that is we actually put metadata and encode and decode. On the decode side, we actually decode that metadata to display the image based on your TV set to make it look ideal. So let's take a look at what the possible next generation visual experiences. We're in 2020 now, so we should be looking at what's ahead. Let's step back a little bit and look at what the evolution of storytelling looked like. And maybe that will give us some clues into how this experience may go about. Initially, you had somebody telling a story to an audience, and then a director was able to capture this with the advent of film, show it to the audience. It was still black and white with no audio. And then they added audio to that. And then they added color and two speakers to make it feel like it was somewhat spatial and you could get some spatialness in the audio. Had Dolby surround sound, which made you feel immersed in the audio field at least, and you'd hear objects going behind you even though the picture wasn't behind you. We improved the resolution as we went by, and then we added Atmos, which actually moved to object-based audio and surrounds you completely. And of course we had to improve the image with the high dynamic range that we were talking about earlier. So where can we go now? I mean, it should be obvious by now that the image is the one that's missing, that's not around you. So how do we get that image to surround you and make you feel more immersed so that we can bring the viewer into that world and experience the story like the director was intended, which is where the director was there himself, and so he brings you to that experience, right? So when you're doing 2D video or flat video, these are the things that we took into consideration. So we looked at resolution, color gamut, and frame rate. And this is what determined the image quality. Of course, as time went by and through the evolution of each of these displays and transmission and capture technology, we went from SD to HD. Now we're at 4K and 8K, in fact. And then frame rates have gone from 15 frames per second to 60 frames per second, and even in gaming monitors up to 144 frames per second. Went from black and white to P3 to Rec 2020. We introduced dynamic range, and I was telling you about the 4,000 nit display that we have, and most of the TVs that are being shipped are about 1,000 nit. These aspects determined quality, and we like to call this the more pixels, faster pixels, in our favorite, better pixel. The next generation video, which has to be immersive, and like we said, it has to envelop you, and you have to be in the space. You have to take into consideration 9 of these things. So what are these 9 axes? Well, we have to add field of view. We have to add latency. We have to add stereo, degrees of freedom, and accommodation inversion. So I'm going to go into each one of these. But the one thing that you have to remember is that we've been talking about image quality for most of the time. But what happens now when we add all of this and we make images immersive, what's going to happen is we're going to need image comfort becomes a critical feature. And image comfort is really important because we can take somebody who's happy with their picture all the way to throwing up if we're not careful. So let's make sure that we deliver a good image that doesn't make people throw up. So let's start with latency and frame rate. When you put an image on your head, let's say it's an AR or VR pair of glasses, and you turn your head, if that image starts dragging with you and then suddenly pops into the right place where it should have been, that's not going to be a very good experience. It's going to make people throw up. That's the worst thing you could do to somebody. So one of the tricks that people use in displays is to do low persistence. So if they can't update the image fast enough, they actually just flash the image for a second. So the display is on for frame 1, and then it's off for a lot of the frame, and then it's on for frame 2, and then it's off for the rest of the frame 2. So what you can see is that at least the picture won't be dragging with you. It flashes, and then you won't see anything for a while, and it flashes again. But it looks like flicker, so that you need to have a minimum frame rate in order to make this work. And this actually is good for brightness as well, because there's a tendency for low persistence displays to be super dim, and that takes away a dynamic range as well. So the next thing we have to look at is parallax in object persistence. So in 3D movies, let's say this is the viewer, and they're looking at 3 objects, object 1, 2, and 3, and object 1 is occluding 2, occluding 3. You can see that that's what the picture would look like to the viewer. It's like one's in front. Now in a 3D movie or even on a 3D TV, if you were to move laterally, what happens is all the objects actually move with you, and you will see that the rate of change of movement for 1, 2, and 3 is all exactly the same. But that's not how the real world works, right? When I move in the real world, each of the objects move at a different rate, and they stay persistent. They stay in their place based on how close they are to you or how far away they're from. The next thing is the field of view. So basically, humans can see 220 degrees, but most TVs that we watch today are only 48 degrees. So you can see it's not fully immersive because it's only occupying 48 degrees of your field of view, and most of your field of view is not engaged, right? So the first generation AR headsets are all been about 30 to 50 degrees, 42 degrees typically. VR headsets were able to achieve a lot more at 110 degrees, which was much more immersive and actually had a good wow effect. The other aspect of field of view is you got to be super careful with is there's an experiment that they've done where they put a person in a corridor with just lines on the wall, and when they move the walls, the visual markers that are in the peripheral vision cause the person standing on the stool to fall because they can't balance. And the reason is we use our peripheral vision for postural and spatial orientation. So what I'd like to say is, like, if you're designing a headset or a immersive experience and you start messing with the pixels on the side where they change rate because of distortions and things like that, it could actually affect the viewer negatively. So we don't want to do that. We need to, what I say is, you need to treat your peripheral pixels with respect. So let's start taking a look at what the eye looks like. There's multiple aspects of the eye, right? So there's the muscles that move the eye, and then there's the muscles that actually move the lens. And then of course we have where the image falls on your eye in terms of the retina, and you have a foveal region, which is where all the resolution is, and I'll get to that in a second. So let's take a look at the concept of accommodation and vergence. So over here, if you look at the way the eye is, this is the eyeball, and if you're looking at the lens, when the lens is contracted, the ciliary muscle is contracting the lens down. That image that's close by actually focuses on the retina, and the far objects actually don't focus and are blurry on the retina. And the rectus muscle actually pulls your eye in so that your eyes verge to a point to focus in on this object. That function, so you can see that I've pointed out that the ciliary muscle is on and the rectus muscle is on. What happens is, looking at the object far away, you'll see that the ciliary muscle and the rectus muscle is off because your eyes are trying to converge on this object and your lens is trying to focus on that object in the back. So this is the same object, just look from top down basically. There's always a connection between these two muscles moving together at all times. And I believe that there's a neural pathway between those two muscles. When you're looking at a display that's really close to you, you'll see that the ciliary muscle, the lens has to focus this image that's on one plane onto your retina, but the rectus muscle has to do all the working in terms of trying to make the object appear near and far. So that vergence is changing, but the ciliary muscle focus is not changing. So that disconnect actually causes problems between these two muscles not being, the neural pathway not being connected. And so what I think actually happens is actually us doing some research on a liquid lens many years ago. We were doing some experiments on this. So what I believe happens is actually that brain has to create a new pathway to say that these two muscles are not connected. When you're watching a 3D movie or watching 3D TV, that accumulation of debt in terms of this disconnect happens and you relearn this new way of experiencing the world. And then when you get out of this experience, you have to relearn what the real world is like, and that's what that discomfort that you feel after a 3D movie is, including the parallax aspect, which I explained. All of this starts to accumulate in debt. There's a theory called the poison theory. Your inner ear and the visual cortex are not responding the way it should. Basically, your body thinks that you're being poisoned, and it tries to get the poison out of you, and that's the reason why you throw up. And it's just a matter of what your tolerance is, basically. So there is another aspect where we have to take care of when we're trying to design. If you follow Marty Banks, he has a paper that talks about another accommodation driver, which is chroma blur and how that falls on your eye. So we should be careful of how we design displays in terms of subpixel rendering and resolution as well, and how we verge on that. The way we do our formats, we subsample chroma a lot. And also the displays now don't necessarily have RGB for every pixel. We start subsampling and doing things to the display. It could be an issue for creating comfort for the user. So we have to be careful of that. Another aspect is the IPD, which is the interpupillary distance. So 3D movies basically capture an object with two cameras. It's at a fixed distance, and the director basically decides what's comfortable. The IPD is the distance between the two eyes, and a person will perceive that the object is at a certain distance based on how they verge, right? But the problem is everybody has slightly different IPDs, and so another person would see the object further away, and probably another person would see it even further away. But the problem is, if it's too close, that could actually create a very uncomfortable experience, and you can cross your eyes. So a certain amount of personalization has to happen, and it can create some distress for the viewer if it's too close, where they're crossing their eyes the whole time. So you don't want to do that. So let's take a look at what we could do. We could actually try to look at people's IPDs and present them an image that's consistent for them, and it's always, the objects are always at the right distance for everybody based on how they view the world. So I think that will make people much happier. So let's look at resolution and fill factor. So TVs take up only about 48 degrees of your field of view, but they're 4K, so 55 inches, 4K TV. So what that means is 3,880 pixels and 48 degrees is much larger than 60 pixels per degree. And what's the 60 pixels per degree magic number? Is basically if you have 20/20 vision on your fovea, you actually are able to see 60 pixels per degree. The other aspect is how the fill factor, I'm not going to cover that too much, but fill factor on TVs that are greater than 70%. So let's take a look at many of the first generation HMDs, right? So the first HMD had 1080 pixels in 110 degrees. Only results in less than 9.8 pixels, and those were sub-pixel rendered too. So it was more like 6 pixels per degree compared to the 60 pixels per degree. So if you wanted 60 pixels per degree, you needed 6,600 pixels in that 60 pixels. And the first headsets, I'm being generous over there, were actually more like 14 to 15%, 30% you can say. If you're looking at the old headsets, it's basically we were going backwards when the user was very used to something that was much more advanced in terms of image quality. So we were going back to 1987 VGA, if you look at it that way. So another aspect that we can take into consideration when we're designing optics and everything is the fact that there's the fovea and the way your eye looks at an image, you're always focusing on a certain part of the image. And so if you just stare at this dot for a second, I'm going to flip over to the next slide, and you can count how many black dots you see. I'll step out of the way so you can look at how many black dots. You probably, if you had really good vision and if you're not moving your eyes, you probably can see maybe 3 black dots at most. But there's actually 15 black dots in this image. And you have to actually look around the image so that the image lands on your fovea in order to be able to see that. So that kind of shows that you're pretty much blind. Here's another one that I like to show basically is if you're staring at the white dot, hopefully you're close enough to your monitor, can you see the letters around and how many B's can you see? Well, actually it spells out blind in the peripheral, and most people can't see that. You still need a format that can present to you all the data. And so what that means is like if you have one frame of data and let's say it's a 360 degree image, the way that's going to look is you need 60 pixels per degree. So therefore, if you unfold that into kind of a cube map and unfold that further, it's 21,600 pixels across and 16,200 pixels high, right? And so let's unpack that further. Well, just to give you an idea, it's about 12 4K images for one frame. And then, of course, if we add light fields to that, which is basically a picture from each point of view so that you could move and give that parallax, you're talking about another 10 to 100 times that, you can see that 100 times 12 4K images for one frame is definitely a data explosion problem. Okay, so let's move to the color issue. So the way you see color is by tristimulus color. So you actually have an RGB light that hits your eye, and the mixing of the R and G and B creates a specific color. And in this case, this person is actually perceiving this to be white, and it's slightly above the green. But one of the problems is because it's actually an approximation of actually what you see in real life, you'll see that other people will not perceive exactly the same. So we actually already have that problem, but you can see the error is very small over there because the bandwidth of these light sources are pretty wide. And so the error is pretty small because there's a variance in terms of people and how they see color. And now we're going to go into immersive imaging in headsets. And so our favorite thing to do is to try to get monochromatic light or very pure light. And so what happens is because of the characteristics of monochromatic light and how we can use waveguides to transmit that to your eye, so you get much purer light, and you get a much wider color gamut. Before we weren't getting decent color gamut, so now you can represent more colors. However, that discrepancy between one viewer to another in terms of what they're seeing in terms of color is much larger, and so we have to take into consideration that as well. So HDR and range control, like I said before, the old TVs were 0.1 nits to about 120 nits, and you had a gamma curve that represented that. And in the gamma curve, you had lots of points down in the blacks, and then you had a few in the brights. But if I wanted to represent, I mean, this was good enough because the eye can only discern so many different gray levels in this range. But the second we increase dynamic range, and in AR and VR we're going to have to, because we're trying to represent the real world, you have to go all the way down to 0.0001 nits, which is super black, and up to 10,000, even 20,000 nits. I mean, if you're standing out in midday and looking at the blacktop, you're talking about like 5,000 to 6,000 nits right there. So if your AR glasses has to show an image, it has to be pretty darn bright. And so you can see actually trying to use this gamma curve and the limited number of points there that we have for 8 bits and try to stretch that over this range. You're going to have a lack of information. There's going to be just banding, and the image is not going to look good. So we have to come up with some curve that's going to make this look much better. So heads up on that gamma display. If you're going to put a gamma display and try to drive it super bright, it's not going to work, right? So the other aspect is we have to be careful of the optics. So like I was saying, a lot of waveguide designs are happening, and what tends to happen is that it destroys contrast. And the same with VR, and when you have Fresnel lenses, you have scattering all over the place, and so you have these God rays, and you lose dynamic range very quickly. So I'm going to quickly cover this. I don't want us to spend too much time, but this is what we see kind of as the ecosystem. You have to have content creation tools that capture all these aspects, these 9 aspects that I'm talking about, and that has to go through a pipeline of tools that can support these. And then you need some kind of a format that we can distribute over the network to each of these new devices that we're talking about, whether they're AR glasses, VR glasses, or light field displays in the future. Right? So, like I always say, content is king, right? So any technology is only going to survive if there's enough interesting content, or the platform is extremely essential to everyday use. So looking at it from an entertainment point of view, if you look at the movie Alita, there was actually 9 million polygons in just her eye. And you can see that a few years ago, Gollum in Lord of the Rings was only 200K polygons. So just her eye, 9 million to 200K polygons. You can see that the complexity required to render these images took days. Even Lord of the Rings, they took days per frame, right? And we're talking about 10 hours probably per frame. It's about the same now. But we need this kind of real-time rendering with this type of quality in a tiny little thing that sits on your headset or in your pocket, right? So that's quite a challenging thing to do, to make something look realistic and to the level that we're expecting, since we've been fed extremely good content that people spend days on rendering. So real-time rendering of content is going to be tricky, basically. And the reason for this is because of Blind's law. Blind's law says, as technology advances, rendering time remains constant. So when they were making Toy Story, they spent actually the same amount of time as they did with Alita in terms of per frame time. So if it took 10 hours in 1990s, it still took 10 hours in 2013 and 10 hours today for the movie, just because of the demands and the way we want images to look more and more realistic and not less game-like, right? So, so with all of this, there's a small problem of data, right? So if we're talking about 60 pixels per degree for the image, 233 million pixels, and we're talking about with HDR, that's 1 gigabyte per frame, and then with light fields, 10 gigabytes per frame, and then at 90 frames per second for the frame rate, and extra metadata to send this over, you can see that we're going to need a cable that's probably the size of these underground transcontinental data lines that go underneath the sea, right? So in summary, I have some suggestions to make. VR HMD recommendations. I think we need to stop 360 videos, and please treat your peripheral pixels. So if you're making an optics system that's like 220 degrees and you're stretching the pixels, that's going to make people sick. So watch out how you rather have a smaller field of view than stretch pixels out just for the sake of saying that you have more field of view, right? And then the other thing with AR glasses, the recommendations is, I said, do nothing well, which means that if the glasses are off, you have to be able to see the world very clearly and not distorted and not having anything else. And I believe to conclude this talk, I believe that we need to come up with a minimum specification of acceptable for products acceptability, so that we don't chase away our customers. One of the things I believe that we can do is we can create a really nasty experience where people experience AR or VR and never want to put on a headset again because it wasn't a pleasant experience and they felt sick or they didn't think it was worth doing the second or third time. So we want to have people come back. So let's define what that minimum experience is along these axes. And that's it. And I'll take some questions if you have after this. Thanks for listening.